Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Ner Yisrael and Rani Close series of Shirim, and thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted tonight that Rabbi Michael Pollack will be speaking on Rabbi Jaime Velozhin, an appreciation on his 200th Yahrzeit. Rabbi Pollack teaches philosophy at JFS and is Page's secondary school coordinator. He's a Daf Hayomi Maggid Shir at Ner Yisrael and also regular tea and Torah contributor at Rani Close Shul. Shir is dedicated to Nishmat Ariela Esther Bat Yontov Lippman, Leonie Lippman, Zichrona Livracha, the daughter of Sandy and Jeffrey Lippman, whose first Yahrzeit was today, the 27th of Iyar. Sandy is a very valued member of our committee organizing the Shirim. We wish Sandy, Jeffrey, and the family Chaim Aruchim. I hand over to you now, Michael. Can you, if you can, oh yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. What I found interesting as people came online, that the tradition of this shir is that women are allowed to sit in the actual main area and men have to hover at the back. And this translates into a virtual custom, which seems to be that women can be have their cameras on and all the men have got their cameras off as a kind of way of replicating the sitting at the back of the shul. So as Susan mentioned, I'm going to talk about someone called Jaime Velozhin. He actually had a surname. His surname was Ikovitz. So if you are an Ikovitz or you know an Ikovitz, you may be scrambling for the family records because he is a very considerable person to be related to. And again, as Susan mentioned, this week is his 200th Yahrzeit. So for that reason, I think it's worth bringing him to everyone's attention. And I'm going to try and persuade you that he had a huge influence way beyond his fame on Judaism as we understand it, as we think it, and as we practice it today. And it's also, as Susan mentioned, it's the first Yahrzeit of Leonie, Jeffrey and Sandy's daughter. And if we're talking about people who valued thinking and valued ideas, as indeed Jaime Velozhin did, then Jeffrey and Sandy certainly come to mind as people who value the world of ideas and the virtue of being scholarly. So it's a very appropriate shidduch between their sponsorship and the topic. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to share. I sincerely hope that this will be visible. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble. So hopefully, can everyone more or less see the slide? Let's make it a little bit bigger. There we are. So Susan, if you just sort of raise a thumb to say that it's visible, excellent. So we're going to be talking about Jaime Velozhin, and these are his secular dates. I am assured that this coming week relates to his Hebrew Yahrzeit, and as you can see, 1821, that's exactly 200 years ago. Now, very often we have pictures of great rabbinic figures from the 18th and even the 19th centuries, and we put them up in our sukkahs, and they are nearly all absolute forgeries. So the picture of Rabbi Volozhin that's in Wikipedia looks to me very similar to the picture of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin of Volozhin, and I think it's a very unreliable picture. We'll come back to unreliable pictures, but what that is definitely a picture of is you're definitely looking there at a picture of the building that was the yeshiva that he set up. So in addition to creating a framework of ideas which define Orthodox Jewish thinking, which I think still persists today, he established the first yeshiva. The word yeshiva is used elsewhere in many different contexts, all the way back to the way Jewish law was organized in Bavel, in Iraq, in the Gemara. But the idea that we're going to have an institution And we're going to attract not just the local people of the town, or not just the rabbi's children or friends of the rabbi. This is going to be an international institution, which is going to attract the best of all over Eastern Europe. And they would be given a specific style of education and then go back to their communities one day with the message. This was an absolute innovation of Reb Chaim, and he set up his yeshiva in the early years of in the first decade. Some people say 1805, some people say 1806. But I'm not going to particularly concentrate on the yeshiva. The yeshiva was an amazing achievement. Out of that yeshiva grew the yeshivot that we're familiar with today. And for that alone, we should drink a l'chaim on his Yahrzeit. But I want to have a look at his ideas much more than the institution that he created. And the challenges that he was facing, so he lived either side of the year 1800. The two great challenges that he understood himself to be facing, that he needed to find a response to, was first of all, the Haskalah. The Haskalah is the Jewish transformation of the Enlightenment. So leading up to the French Revolution, thinkers across Europe were beginning to apply rationalism in particular to all sorts of thinking, particularly law and ethics, big attempts to make them put them on a rational basis. And Jewish thinkers started saying, well, let's do the same for Judaism. Let's see if we can make Judaism a more rational endeavor. Moses Mendelssohn is credited with being, oh, excuse the very clumsy typing mistake. Oh no, it's fine. There are two S's. Moses Mendelssohn is credited with being the father of the Jewish Enlightenment. And it was certainly considered a challenge by the Rabbonim in Eastern Europe. But I don't think that they took it that seriously. Whereas the other challenge that they took very, very seriously was the emergence of Hasidut. And we're going to be able to compare the response that Jaime Velozhin had towards Hasidut and his very precise attempt to dismantle it, and how that really had a real world influence and things changed because of his efforts and his ideas. Whereas when it comes to the Haskalah, whether it was a lack of enthusiasm, he didn't really have the same impact. So let's have a look at who was Chaim Velozhin. So let's just have a little bit of the basic facts. The basic facts. Oh, we've lost a date, but you know what it is. So Chaim Velozhin had a surname, Ikovitz. He was born in 1749, and he passed away in, as we know, it's the 200th Yahrzeit. He passed away in 1821. And what's important, what gives him stature, is his relationship to the Vilna Gaon. Now, the Vilna Gaon died in 1790. I'm not quite sure why we don't know dates as clearly as we might do, but either he died in 1797 or 1799. And he was unquestionably, halachically, the towering figure of Jewry in Eastern Europe. All the big questions would end up with him. He was, as his title suggests, he was in Vilna. It's going to be important for us to remember that Vilna was largely a Jewish town. There was a very large Jewish community, which very often was a majority. So whilst the Vilna Gaon would be very sensitive to strange movements within Judaism, he may not be that sensitive to things coming from the outside. So he's going to be relaxed, maybe, about the Haskalah, because he's not familiar with the secular origins of these ideas. There is no large intellectual Christian community in Vilna. unlike in Berlin, for example. So he'd be very nervous about things that start rippling through Orthodox Judaism, like Hasidut, but would be less nervous or less even aware of the Haskalah. So the status of Jaime Velozhin, despite the fact that the Vilna Gaon had sons, but everyone deferred to Jaime Velozhin as the standard bearer after the Vilna Gaon himself passed away. And even during the lifetime of the Vilna Gaon, Chaim was considered to be his assistant, his deputy, the person you went to if you wanted to find out what did the Vilna Gaon have to say about things. So the challenge from Hasidut, as far as the Vilna Gaon himself, and so you may be aware that as soon as the Hasidic movement started extending out of the very small area that it started with, the Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, passed away in 1764. I think we know that date. So he passed away in 1764. And by the time we get to the end of the century, Hasidut was beginning to be, I'm using the value judgment and calling it a threat, but it started making its way into big Jewish communities like Vilna, which is the capital of Lithuania. And it certainly made a lot of progress in Galicia and in more southern areas where the Baal Shem Tov had lived. So what was wrong with Hasidut? Why were the opponents of Hasidut so excited and so determined to stamp on it and absolutely stop it? And really, it became Jaime Velozhin's life work. We don't have much by way of his Torah writings in general. We have a few tshuvot, but we do have a book called Nefesh HaChaim, absolutely devoted to dismantling and stopping Hasidut in its tracks. And when we look at some of the quotes, we'll see how strong the language he uses against the early Hasidic thinkers, Hasidic leaders. So very simply, he didn't have much against them, except that the leaders were the wrong people, the leaders had the wrong ideas, and the leaders had the wrong practices. Otherwise, they were ideal. So pretty much there wasn't much about them that he liked at all. People are very eager to try and bring peace to the world of history and say, yeah, maybe he did like them. And they found one of the, they were issuing excommunication documents with some regularity, even to the extent that they reported Rav Shneur Zalman Miliadi, who was, although he didn't know it, he is considered the founder of the Chabad movement. I'm not sure he would recognize his movement if he appeared again, but he is considered the founder of Chabad. He ended up in jail. He ended up in jail because the people associated with the Vilna Gaon had reported him as being a dangerous person to the secular authorities. That was the extent of all this. And documents excommunicating Hasidic leaders were being put out with great regularity. And they found one which Reb Chaim Velozhin didn't sign. So people want to say, yeah, he was really in favor of Hasidut, or at least he wasn't virulently against it. And you've got to realize that he was really looking for peace. It's a bit of a mistake because the document that they looked to was signed by the rabbis of Vilna. And although Volozhin and Vilna begin with the same letter, they do run out of same letters after the first one. And very much, I'm pretty convinced that if Reb Chaim had been in Vilna, he'd have signed. The fact that it was the rabbis of Vilna means that he didn't sign. So he is going to launch this fight against the early Hasidic movement. So if you consider that the Baal Shem Tov died in 1764, we've got about 30 years for the movement to spread through Europe before the real reaction starts. So I've categorized the objections to the Hasidic movement in 3 categories. And I'd like to go through each one of the categories and show you how Reb Chaim attacked that. And then we'll consider, did that really change anything in the end? So the first objection was, who were these leaders? Who were they? So let's have a look at the Baal Shem Tov. So the Baal Shem Tov was considered to be, first of all, the Baal Shem Tov did something which great leaders should remember. He didn't write a single word. If you've got excellent students, which he did have, and you don't write anything, then they're going to do a really good job of describing your worldview. So we don't have a single letter, and I say letter, I don't mean epistle, I mean Aleph, Bet, or Gimel, that was written by the Baal Shem Tov. If there are people in the audience who are feeling uncomfortable about that, and they want to say, yes, there's this, there's the letter of the Baal Shem, and there may be a couple of things, but the general consensus is that they were written by students. So we actually don't know what he knew and what he didn't know. And that gave people like Jaime Velozhin an opportunity to say that he was lacking in Torah study. We have no output from the Baal Shem Tov at all to suggest that he was a Talmid Chacham. There are no published works. His students, so the leading student was someone called Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, and he actually writes a Pirush on the Torah, and in his Pirush on the Torah, there are 300 references to things that he heard from the Baal Shem Tov. So this does seem to be some kind of output, but really difficult to say of someone who didn't leave anything behind, whether he was a Torah leader or not. What he did seem to be very good at was healing people. We have, as reliable as possible, reliable accounts that people felt better having been with him. And then we can look at his name. His name actually, no mother calls their son Baal and Shem. It means that he was the Baal, the owner. Shem is a name, and he was owner of a good name. So that means that he knew how to manipulate the various names of God, and he could use them to affect incredible outcomes. And that's what he was known as. He was, I think magician is a bit unkind, but he was a mystical person who actually did things in the world to make the world a better place. Now here, so we can have a look at something that Jaime Velozhin writes, talking about the leaders of the movement. So this is in Nefesh HaChaim. So we'll see that the Hasidic movement, it becomes very interested in the idea of dveikut, becoming close to Hashem. And they talk about it a lot. And Chaim says, many of those who have desired the path of dveikut, in other words, the Hasidim, have chosen for themselves as the main area of study works of piety. They're learning maybe Hasidut, maybe it's a reference to some mystical works, but they're not learning mainstream Torah. And the light of Torah has never shined on them. So pretty strong. The leaders of the Hasidic movement have never really got involved in Torah. And just in case you think he thinks that's acceptable, he says, and may God forgive them. So it's a very, very strong ad hominem personal attack on the early Hasidic leaders. We'll see that as we go through the categories, we'll see that there were things going on which were certainly surprising. But in the descriptions of what the Hasidim were getting up to, and these aren't necessarily descriptions coming from the obvious opponents, but there's lots of talk about dancing and somersaults and drunkenness, and emphasis on physicality, on shuckling, and general, perhaps mayhem. And that didn't go down at all well with the established leadership. Let's have a look at what else. They had the wrong ideas. Now, the wrong ideas means that they looked in the Kabbalah, and in the Kabbalah, they found reasons to forgive certain sins. Now, this is a quote from a slightly later figure. This is the Rebbe of Ishbitz, and he's writing in the middle of the 19th century, but his ideas very much relate to earlier ideas that we see in the Hasidic movement. So it's a bit sort of grimy, I suppose. So I'm not going to ask anyone else to read it, and I'll read a bit of it so you get the feeling. This is in his comment. So this is the Rebbe of Ishbitz. He wrote, I think it's a magnificent book, but it does get very close to the knuckle in its approach to halakha and its approach to the idea of sin. And this is in his commentary on the murder of Zimri, who was a prince of the Jewish people, and he was found with, won't go into the details of what with means here, but very much with Cosby, and she is a Midianite princess, and Pinchas kills them. So this is, so if you could just follow for the first few lines, and he says, and you shouldn't think, chas v'shalom, that Zimri was an adulterer, chas v'shalom. So there's a lot of chas v'shaloms in that sentence. He wants us not to think badly of Zimri. For HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't make a whole section of the Torah out of an adulterer. If this was just him and Cosby misbehaving, well, we don't need to defile the Torah with a story about people misbehaving. Rather, there is a hidden mystery in this matter. For there are 10 levels of lust. The first level is one who adorns himself and explicitly goes out for sinful purposes. So that's sort of that's sort of someone who's just looking for physical pleasure. But then he says, but after this, the remaining 9 levels are people who are looking for greater truths. And the greater truth that Zimri was looking for was that he had discovered that the other half of his soul was this Cosby, and he wasn't doing anything wrong at all. And Pinchas coming along to kill him was a terrible mistake. Zimri and Cosby were doing absolutely the right thing. In the very deep sense, they were made for each other. And in the sense that they were made for each other, they were doing what's right. If you find the person that you're made for, who complements your soul, then there should be nothing that stands between you and that union. And very serious criticism of Pinchas in this idea of the Rebbe of Ishbitz. And it's really not a one-off. We see over and over again through the writings of the early Hasidic leaders, whether it's in Reb Nachman, or there's a sefer called Bnei Yisachar, of the Rebbe of Dinov, where they will say that, the Rebbe of Ishbitz had a pupil called Rav Tzadok of Lublin. And these people are over and over again saying, you know, sometimes what looks to you like a sin is actually an elevated act. You're doing the right thing. And how do you know when it's a sin and when it isn't? Well, it's a sin if you're doing it for the wrong reason. But if you genuinely are doing it for the right reason, then you can float above the norm. You can defy ordinary halakha, and this is not only acceptable, it's a really good idea. So there's a play on words that the Bnei Yisachar used. I think the Bnei Yisachar was in sort of 1830s. And he said that the Torah says, Lo ta'asun kein, which for hundreds of years was translated as, you shouldn't do certain things. In the early Hasidic worldview, he took the word law to be, there are certain things which are prohibited sometimes, the law says of the Torah, law, but we, ta'asun kain, sometimes you have to do them. So however unacceptable an act is, sometimes you've got to do that act. And this is, these ideas run through much of the early Hasidic writings. Where it's totally absent is in the writings of Shnei Zalman of Liadi of Chabad. He doesn't take this line at all, but many others do. And you can imagine how sitting in Volozhin or sitting in Vilna, these ideas would have been really worrying. So, Rabbi Chaim wants to explain to people that we can't mess around with a halacha. We can't just say, yes, this act, because it's being done for the right reasons, is terrific. And he wants us to understand how every act that a human being does is absolutely, not only has implications for that person, but he writes that God created man b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Well, God is a creator of the world. God controls the world. And we too have the power to control the world and to create forces. I think this is a quote from the Nefesh HaChaim again. God created man similar to himself. With his thought and speech, man maintains and provides to higher worlds. So our actions don't only impact on us, our actions change the universe, change higher worlds. I have no idea what that means, but it certainly puts a very serious responsibility on human beings to be very careful with varying the halakha and with making exceptional rules and not keeping a very tight ship when it comes to the halakha. So he didn't like them. He didn't like their ideas. What else didn't he like? There's another idea that they had that he really didn't like. And this idea comes from the Ari. The Ari is the great organizer of the Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, who lived in Sfat in the 16th century. And he was another one of the great leaders who never wrote a word. We don't have a single word written by the Ari. And everything that we have from him is from his pupils, particularly Reb Chaim Vital. So if you're planning to leave a legacy of great Jewish revolution, say nothing or write nothing and get yourself some decent students, because that seems to be the way to do it. Now, the Ari raised the issue of the presence of God in the world. And every Shabbat, we say in the Kedusha, Kvodo Malei Olam. So that means that God's glory fills the world. And the question is, what did the Ari mean by that? What was this? God's glory fills the world. So it would seem to be that what we're saying is that God is everywhere. Everything, God is everywhere and everything. And that actually is the position the Baal Shem Tov took. The Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement, particularly Rav Nachman with Breslov, said, don't get too excited about the details of halakha, because you can go out to a forest and in the silence of the forest, you can encounter God. You can encounter God in the trees, because the trees are merely an expression of the divine. So this was an amazingly powerful idea. If you want to get close to God, you don't have to go to a shul necessarily. You don't have to open a Gemara. There are all sorts of ways of becoming close to God, of inspiring yourself. It may be through some kind of meditation, which was in Breslov was considered very important. It may be, certainly the Hasidic movement has never been short of people advocating the power of the occasional vodka. Certainly a nigun, where do we see the power of nigunim until we get to the Hasidic movement? So all those ideas reflect the big principle of kvodo male olam. We don't have to do anything difficult to find God. We actually just have to impact on ourselves. We have to unlock our hearts, and then the immanence of God is going to be everywhere. Now, to say that Jaime Velozhin didn't like this at all is a huge understatement. He really didn't like this. And he, first of all, he mocks the Hasidim. And he says, when they go to the lavatory, they're going to be praying there. It's perfectly clear that it's not true that Kvodo Male Olam. And there are places which the presence of God is absent from. And instead of interpreting Kvodo Male Olam, that God is everywhere, he has this analogy of a bookshelf. And the relationship of the bookshelf to the books. The bookshelf isn't the books, but the bookshelf ensures that the books remain in place. And that's his analogy for the relationship of God to this world. We are not God. I'm sorry to tell you, none of us are entirely part of the divine being, but we are perpetually supported by God's presence in the same way that a bookshelf supports books. And he dispensed of this idea. He really, really thought that it was a terrible idea. And let's just complete my trilogy. So I said wrong people, wrong ideas, and wrong practices. So he was very upset. First of all, they changed to Nusach Sfarad. Nusach Sfarad is the style of davening which came out of Spanish Jewry and is unique to those communities that established around the Mediterranean basin through and after the Middle Ages. The Hasidic leaders decided that the Ari in particular, his style of davening was much holier, and therefore we should abandon Ashkenaz, the traditional East European way of davening, and replace it with Sfarad. That didn't go down well, but changing the times of tefillah really, really didn't go down well. And this is still a big issue in Hasidut today, that we see the embers of this idea that I'm only going to daven when I'm ready to daven. If I'm not ready to daven mincha, then I'm not going to daven mincha. It may be 12 o'clock at night, but I'm still going to wait till I'm ready. This idea, which became very important in the Hasidic movement, really didn't go down well again with Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim describes a conversation that he heard. A man says to his friends, let's daven mincha. The fellow answers him, oh, let's wait for the stars to appear in the skies. In other words, there's no rush, we'll do it at night. And then he lashes out at them, may the Lord forgive them and pardon the unwary and the fool. And again, that's from Nefesh Chaim. So I'm going to unshare for a moment. And so his attack on the Hasidic movement is really, really powerful. The language is powerful, the arguments are powerful, and he really doesn't let up at all. And it's interesting to see what actually happens in the Hasidic movement in the period immediately following his life. Because what we see is a response in the Hasidic movement to become more mainstream. So the Hasidic movement is almost like a coach and horses about to drive itself off a cliff in its attitude to halacha, which, had it continued unabated, would have been pretty disastrous for large Jewish communities across Eastern Europe. They responded to Jaime Velozhin somewhere around the 1840s. So they're responding to him, and they're responding to the ideas coming from his yeshiva, and they suddenly realized that their leadership without Torah learning was absolutely hopeless. And suddenly we see a change in the type of leader. We no longer see charismatic, magical Hasidic leaders, but if we scan the Hasidic world at that time, you see in Galicia, the first of the Halberstams are a very important dynasty in the Hasidic world. That takes you into Bobov, Tzanz, Klosenburg. So all of those derive from a figure called Chaim Halberstam, who wrote books called Divrei Chaim. Chaim Halberstam is a Talmud Chacham. He's the first Rebbe of a very important dynasty, but he's got a book. He's a Talmud Chacham. We know that he was a considerable intellectual figure. Then you see in Poland, in Warsaw, the first Rebbe of the Ger dynasty, Yitzchak Meir Morgenstern. He's a Talmud Chacham. He produces books. He has a pirish on Chumash. He has a pirish on the Talmud. We see the first Sochotchover Rebbe. He writes a book called the Avnei Nezer Shuvas. He writes Eglei Tal, which is an analysis of Hilchos Shabbos. Suddenly, people are popping up because the intellectual attack that was coming from Rabbi Jaime Velozhin and his Talmidim, that you lot are just a waste of time. You've got stupid ideas, and none of you are familiar with the literature of the Torah. And he really does, and I think he really does have an effect. There are internal things within the Hasidic movement which also add to that, and the need to stop the coach and horses going off the cliff and try and bring it back. But unquestionably, the counter movement that Rav Chaim starts and continues through his yeshiva has a real effect and really does change the Jewish world and makes Hasidut an acceptable alternative within the Jewish world. And we actually move towards the end of the 19th century, where Hasidim and the Lithuanians or Misnagdim, whatever you want to call that faction, work together. And they create ultimately something called the Aguda, where kind of everyone sort of gets on. So that's the area of great success. In a couple of minutes, I just want to compare that to the other area that I said that was a challenge at the time. And we'll see that he's nowhere near as enthusiastic as sorting that out as he is sorting out the Hasidim. Although it's very explicitly an issue, people are writing about it. So the challenge of the Enlightenment, so it appears first of all in the Orthodox Jewish world, in this thing down here at the bottom. This thing down here at the bottom, you might be able to see the word biur. Biur means explanation, and this explanation is a translation and an explanation of the Chumash, and it's written by it's written by Moses Mendelssohn. For some reason, I'm not able to move on. Yeah, it was first published in 772. It was translated by Mendelssohn, commentary by someone called Shlomo Dubner. However, they were not considered to be the enemy in the way the Hasidim were, because we see Dubner's commentary, so his part of the biur, so his partnership with Mendelssohn was actually republished in Vilna. And if you look at which rabbis wrote at the front that this is a tremendous achievement, Reb Chaim's older brother Zalman is one of the signatories saying this is terrific. So clearly they were much more willing to give time and space to the Enlightenment thinkers. Dubner was a considerable Talmud Chacham, Orthodox Jew. We're not talking about some secular figure here. But nevertheless, he was closely associated with Mendelssohn, and people were very happy to work with him. The Vilna Gaon also asked someone called Baruch Mishklov to translate Euclid into Hebrew. And this idea that the Vilna Gaon wanted people to have an acquaintance with secular knowledge means that he's not altogether nervous about the influence of Enlightenment thinking. There is value, he thinks, in secular knowledge, and he doesn't want his Talmidim to lose out on something like Euclid's geometry. So stop sharing there. So what actually happens is that in the yeshiva in Volozhin, no Hasidim, not a chance. And the impact of Reb Chaim's thinking really dents some of the larger Hasidic figures and movements, and really effectively holds them back, and does help guide the Hasidic movement back into the mainstream. What we see in Volozhin with regards to Haskalah, though, is we know that there was a secret library in Volozhin of Haskalah works. We know that some of the great geniuses of the Haskalah were impressed with or close to the yeshiva in Volozhin, and the person who is most associated with the degree to which Volozhin allowed Haskalah thinking is Bialik. Bialik was obviously ended up being a great national poet, certainly a member of the new wave of rational thinkers. But Bialik was a Volozhin yeshiva buffer. He was there, and he tells us about how books were traded and how secret meetings took place. But all that was only possible because no one was really fighting against the Haskalah in Volozhin in the same way that they were fighting against Hasidut. So I think I'm going to stop. But just to say, this is, obviously it's my opinion, I think Hasidut would not be what it is today, a mainstream Jewish way of life, if it weren't for the huge opposition of Reb Chaim Velozhin. On the other hand, he really didn't turn his attention to the Haskalah, and therefore the Haskalah made its own merry way and became a very powerful, and ultimately sort of gave birth to the progressive movements who've even become, in certain countries, the majority movements within Judaism. And I always sort of wonder if Reb Chaim Velozhin had taken the Haskalah more seriously and let the Hasidim go along their own route, what kind of Jewish world we'd be living in. So, Susan, that's everything I have to say about Jaime Velozhin.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Was there anybody else that went along with Rav Chaim? I mean, did he have any supporters? I mean, you talk about him being the main one against Hasidim, but was there nobody else in the Jewish world at the time that helped him?
Well, there were figures, certainly around the circle of the Vilna Gaon. The Rabbonim in Germany definitely thought that Hasidus was just ridiculous, but it didn't appeal to the German temperament anyhow, so they weren't really fighting the fight. There were early 19th century figures, and even say that Khatam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, wasn't madly enthusiastic. Noda Yehuda, who's the chief rabbi of Prague, wasn't madly enthusiastic. But no one launched a propaganda campaign supported by books, institutions, and visiting lecturers. He put together a campaign against the eccentricities or the excesses of early Hasidut in a way that was really devastating. I'm not sure whether there were committee meetings where they discussed how they were going to do it, but it was really a concerted effort to bring down the greatest successes of early Hasidut, and it worked.
Thank you.
Anyone else got any questions?
Can I just ask you, Michael, I must tell you, Aubrey loved the Baal Shem Tov. He did a lot of research into him, and he thought he was a very charismatic person. And he always used to tell me that they davened outside in the fields, and to daven there, they felt they related and got closer to Hashem that way.
Right. So it used to be, until 20 years ago, we knew nothing firsthand about the Baal Shem Tov. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I remember when I remember talking to someone called Malkiel Kotler, who today is the Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood. And he said, I don't think the Baal Shem Tov ever existed. And it would be perfectly legitimate, given the knowledge we had in those days, a little bit eccentric, but to say that he didn't exist. But if he did exist, what exactly do we know about him? Now, amazingly, an Israeli scholar called Moshe Rosman was doing some work in a town called Mezhibozh, which is where the Baal Shem Tov was reputed to live. And he was looking at Jewish contributions to the poll tax in Mezhibozh. And he came across this house, which was the house of Rabbi Israel. Israel was the first name of the Baal Shem Tov. And that house belonged to the Baal Shem. And because he was a communal figure, he didn't have to pay poll tax. So by going through tax records, we've actually, I think it should be true for all teachers and rabbinic figures, by the way, that we have to pay tax, but so far haven't sold it to anyone. So we have found the historical Baal Shem Tov, and Malkiel, I've never chased him on it, but presumably he will accept that the fellow did exist. There's the legend, so there's the legend, which is incredibly attractive and very, very charismatic and really wonderful. How much of that legend is actually true? There's nothing to say Aubrey's wrong, but he may not be quite as right as we don't know enough about him.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. And what about Reb Nachman and Breslov, the Breslover Rebbe?
He existed.
Yeah.
He was a great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. But
I knew there was a relationship.
He didn't write anything either. He also learned from the Ari, write nothing. He had an assistant or a pupil called Reb Natan Gestetner, and he wrote everything. Everything we have from Reb Nachman was written by him.
Mm-hmm. We had the late Breslover Rebbe was at my daughter's wedding in 1990. Aubrey got him to come. He lived in, not in Bnei Brak, near Gola, in Meir Sharim. We went to visit him there. It was quite an experience.
So the sort of attitude to timing and davening at the right time still hasn't entirely been expunged, despite the virulent attack from Jaime Velozhin. I remember going to Bnei Brak to visit the Lela Forever, and there's not much to do in Bnei Brak on a Saturday night, so cinemas. So going to see Rebbes was about the most entertaining thing one could do. And I went to see the Lela Forever, who ran his Tish, so his main event, and it took place after, for me, Shabbos had gone out. But he was only warming up to daven mincha, so they would daven mincha about 10 o'clock at night. He had this amazing trick where he called his father up for shlishi at mincha, which was a great trick because his father had been dead for 30 years. And this whole abandonment of time and place and reality, it was very characteristic of the early Hasidim. There is a Rebbe in Yerushalayim today called the Amshinov Rebbe, who's largely a very good bloke, and his father was very saintly, but his father didn't take Shabbos out till Tuesday. And Mincha on Shabbos would take place sometime Tuesday morning, because that was kind of where he's up to. So you can understand why Jaime Velozhin was so determined to try and put a stamp on this stuff, and even Amshinov, who was a big tzaddik, but one of the outcomes of Amshinov was Shlomo Carlebach. Shlomo Carlebach was a big fan of the Rebbe of Ishbitz and was a big fan of yes, Charles, you're right. It's the Gera Rebbe said of the Lelever Rebbe. Charles has reminded us that the Gera Rebbe said, they said to him, the Lelever Rebbe is such a fantastic Rebbe. He even calls his dead father up for Shlishi. And the Gera Rebbe said, yeah, I'd like to see him give him Hagba though. So a well-known story. But there is a danger in this stuff. It sounds romantic and very exciting, but Shlomo Carlebach, who had some very important failings, apart from the fact that he only knew 4 guitar chords. But in addition to that, he certainly wouldn't survive the world we live in at the moment, with things like Me Too and anti-abuse stuff. And he would excuse himself using these very broad ideas of the early Hasidim, and he assured everyone that the Amshinova Rebbe knew everything he was doing, and it was fine. So I'm not quite sure whether that was an answer to anyone's question, but
thank you. That was really fascinating. Does anyone else want to make a comment or ask a question? Okay, so thank you so much. Really inspiring and fascinating analysis of Rabbi Jaime Velozhin and bringing his teachings alive for us, as well as his influence on Judaism. So thank you. Next week is Shavuot, so our next show will be in 2 weeks' time when Rabbi Zobin will be speaking. If anyone wants to make a dedication of any of our shirim, please let me know or Naomi Landy know. An announcement on behalf of Raleigh Close about their Rosh Chodesh shir this Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock by Batsheva Burns on Love Conquers All at their usual Zoom link. If anyone wants to know the usual Zoom link, you can contact me or Naomi Landy or Reva Ross. So thank you very much again to Rabbi Pollack. And you can see the thanks in the chat, and you can.
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All the best, everyone. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again.